Hi, guys, and welcome to the Collective VC podcast. Today, we're joined by Doerte from the Climentum Capital. She's general partner. I'm also joined by Amber, who is going to be co-hosting this episode, which I'm super pleased about because usually it's just me. Welcome, Doerte. I've introduced you as a general partner, but I guess that's just taking your accomplishments. So if there's anything more human you'd like to say about yourself and let our viewers know more about you, then over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me here. So indeed, I'm a general partner at Climentum Capital, and that's my core role now. I have previously been an operator. I worked for McKinsey, Rocket Internet, had my own software company. And in around 2020, I realized that we really need to do this green transition towards carbon neutrality, and that finance and investments are needed for that. And that's what I focus on now fully.
And would you like to describe the thesis a little bit more in detail about what you get up to at Climentum?
Yeah, so we believe that we do need real CO2 reduction in this decade. And this is what we invested. So companies that can realize something already now and companies that have direct reduction potential. And that leads to a lot of hard tech. So we don't shy away from hardware. We do that. We also like software. Often it's a combination. But we do invest in topics like heat pumps, recycling technologies, green hydrogen, new fuel technologies, also new materials that are needed for the green transition. So it's always B2B, it's always industrial, it's always European companies, and we help them to scale from a prototype or pilot customers to something big and big revenues.
Would you classify yourself as more of like a climate but yet deep tech generalist, or is it more something to do with the Article 9 associations in the European law? Could you shine a bit of light on that?
Yeah, we are Article 9. We usually don't say that we are deep tech because a lot of the stuff is not so deep. A heat pump is nothing revolutionary. But we just believe that it needs a bunch of technologies, and there's not this one golden thing that will solve everything to make the green transition in Europe. And then that way we're an early stage fund, we're risk taking, but we also, what we do is very different to the classical software VC model. So it's a lot more about finding the right capital structures, including capex financing with debt and grants and so on. Of course, also equity, also follow-on rounds in VC, but that's really only one part of what we do. And then it's a lot about engineering and scaling and how to build big plans or how to negotiate with big partners, large conglomerates, which can maybe produce for the startups and so on. Yeah, so that's also a lot of our work to help navigate with that. And yeah, we are an Article 9 fund. We have a dual carry model. So our carry does not only depend on the financial performance of the companies, but also at the CO2 reduction at fund closing, so in around 10 years. So we always want to see both. We want to see the financial growth, but also the big CO2 savings.
So how does that directly influence carry? I'm curious.
So we get 20% carry as many funds, but 15% only have a financial hurdle rate, and the last 5%, we have a CO2 reduction target, which is 1 million ton annually across the portfolio. And if we reach that, we get the last 5%. If not, we have to donate it to good cause. Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about the Scandinavian startup ecosystem and how that compares to maybe the German startup ecosystem or more mainland Europe startup ecosystems, and whether or not that plays a role in your investment decisions?
Yeah. As a background, so we are headquartered in Denmark. I have two partner colleagues in Denmark, one in Sweden, and I'm based in Berlin. So we invest across Europe, but our core is obviously Scandinavia and the DACH region. And I think what we see is that Scandinavia is a bit ahead. There are many interesting technologies, but I think interesting technologies we also have in Germany or any other countries. But what we see there is also the ability to finance that also with bigger time. So especially in Sweden, there are several well-established investors who have historically invested more in software-related businesses and that now move big into industrial climate tech like Northvolt, H2 Green Steel, but also several other approaches. And there are a handful of investors who do that, who do big tickets that still involve some technical risk. And that is something that is way harder to find for example, in Germany. And the other thing is the teams. So in Germany, we often have great teams coming out of university, but then you have 3 guys with 6 PhDs and a lot of technical knowledge. But you ask yourself, who will scale that? Who will do the fundraising and the sales and all that? And in Scandinavia, both Denmark and Sweden, the ecosystems are smaller. And then you have very often an inventor plus a really good engineer who can build a plant plus a commercial guy. And way easier to find these ideal team mixes. Yeah, I think these are some important differences that we often observe.
I would like to know about like the government support. Is there any difference between like Scandinavia and Germany? And could you talk more about that?
Yeah. So government support is very important for many startups, but it's also very fragmented and always a big puzzle. And we de facto have big lists of who supports what, and it's sometimes the geography. In Germany, it's often even the sub-geography, so only in one state or city. And then it's also the industry. Yes, so you have some biotech stuff and some energy transition stuff, some hydrogen stuff. And so literally every founder needs to find out what puzzle pieces can fit where. And it's also, of course, related to stage and TRL and all that. And I wouldn't say that there is much more in a country like Denmark or Sweden, but it's easier to get an overview because it will always be Sweden-wide or Denmark-wide, and the ecosystem will know each other. In Germany, it's way more fragmented. Of course, there's now currently a bit of a pause on many public investments in Germany. But in general, there are also big buckets, but it just often requires even more time to get them and to find the right ones. Yeah.
And when it comes to getting like good co-investor sentiment, depending on which country you're operating a deal in, would you say that's kind of different depending on which geography you're looking at? I know, for example, in the UK, I talk to a lot of American investors through my work, and they're not so sold on UK startups. Maybe they don't really understand the tax laws and stuff like that. So what does that look like in your case when you're working with different geographies? What would you say the sort of sentiment from your fellow investors is?
Yeah, I think most investors invest Europe-wide, but there's always a specialty and always a network that you are closer to, and that is obviously different in Scandinavia and in Germany. And what I see is even within Scandinavia is different. And you see that, for example, also in the valuations. Yeah. So when we talk to a Finnish or Norwegian startups, it's often very local. The valuations are low. In Denmark, they're a bit higher. In Sweden, they're even higher, probably at the same level as Germany. And then UK is even higher, because I think UK also, although you said many US investors are resistant, I think they either invest in the UK than in any other country, also because of the language barrier and all that stuff. Yeah. So there are differences, but fundamentally the funds and partners that we co-invest mostly are relatively global. Yeah. Or European, I would say, probably more European.
I actually read about your partner interview, and I actually want to know more about Article 9 fund. Could you dive deeper into this Article 9 fund, and then what's the difference between the generalist VCs? Because I think there's a huge difference, and especially towards the climate investing,
Yeah. So Article 9 is a classification of the European Union, and funds that are attached to that basically follow a protocol where they select companies based on certain criteria. In our case, it's really ClimateTech related, so the companies need to fulfill that. But we also check other sustainability factors, so ESG related. So it's also so we also ask them to track how many females they have in certain positions, and working rights and all these kind of things. Yeah. And Article 9 is the highest standard. Then there's Article 8, which is a bit more light and basically just forbids you to do stuff that is not nice. And then Article 6 is basically what everyone does. And we have been bored and started as Article 9. And I think that makes it easier than if you are a fund that exists for 20 years and then you're transitioning into Article 9, because then you all of a sudden can't do certain things and you have to do more reporting and all that stuff. So for us, we were born that way, and my colleague Stefan is the one who is mastering that. And we were also in Denmark the first Article 9 fund. So in a way, it's a European regulation, but then it's broken down to local laws. And so he was also, of course, involved in how this is now done in Denmark. And I'm mostly an investor in our fund, and I can say it does not limit us fundamentally. I mean, from my vision and mission, I only want to invest in green companies. Yeah, and this is why I started this fund. And there are very rare cases where we say, "Ooh, but this could actually be an Article 9 problem or so." I think the most obvious case is when you have something for example, in the materials world. Yeah, you have some new material that can, I don't know, be a coating to something. Then you often have a situation where this could be a coating for, I don't know, to store hydrogen or to or energy or whatever, but it could also be a coating to, I don't know, for drones to make them not visible in radar. So how would we handle this and can this become a conflict to our Article 9 mission? So these things can be relevant, and it's the higher risk, the earlier the go with a company. So if this is a material that is still in scientific stage and you don't have real customers, then it's really risky that the first customer who will jump on that has nothing to do with our climate mandate. And this is also one reason why we don't do pre-seed. We only invest in seed, and often it's rather a late seed, because we want to know what this company is and what the customers will be, and the product should fundamentally work. And then there's still a lot of pivoting and changes, as we all know, but it's much more likely to be at least in a certain direction. Yeah.
So if you're investing in like a nascent technology, like you said, it could go in lots of different directions. Have you ever had to deal with any of those sort of ethical considerations, dilemmas that you're mentioning? And then a kind of second question on top of that is, how can you really ensure that something's going in the right direction? I know you said you only invest above a certain stage, but even at that stage, can you be sure that it's going where you want it to
go? So we have not done several investments, and that was a decision in the due diligence phase when we realized, hey, the risk is actually there. But we, of course, also have situations in our portfolio. So, for example, we invested in a company called Jolt, and they do electrodes for primarily green hydrogen. So in every electrolyzer, you need electrodes, and these are coated metal plates that essentially create the oxygen and the H2. And these electrodes, and you also have in other stuff. For example, in every swimming pool, you have them. Yeah. So as you might have heard, the whole H2 hydrogen ecosystem in Europe is a bit delayed right now. There are still other regions like Middle East which are progressing very quickly and where they now make first revenues. But they have now a plant that is ready, and there could be a scenario that it does not get filled as quickly with green hydrogen. So they have now the potential to fill it up also with swimming pool electrodes, which is obviously not a climate case. Yeah, I mean, probably we all would want less swimming pools from a climate perspective. But then we are enough financially incentivized to say, okay, we do that. Yeah, it's also not harmful. It's not a weapon. Yeah, so do that, get revenues, get across the line, become a successful company. And we know that the founders are mission aligned. So they have fundamentally only started this company because they also want the other element, and that's not a problem for us. Yeah. So even if next year they only make swimming pools revenue, yeah, we are relatively certain that this will not stay like that. Yeah.
And I saw about like the nuclear power thing. Is there anything like you need to mention about, because this is really kind of, for us it's kind of like we think of like the dangerous side of it, the negative side. So what makes you to invest on the nuclear power startup?
Yeah. So I'm German, and in Germany, as you might know, stepped out
It's
of
controversial,
nuclear.
right?
Yeah, and the risks are very well debated here, and so we looked at all the numbers and how the European energy system that will still require more energy and electricity going forward, how that can work. And the honest answer is it's very hard with only sun and wind. Battery storage and hydrogen can play a part, but that is very costly. And fundamentally, you need this baseload power. And there are weeks in winter where you have hardly any sun and sometimes also not much wind. And so we fundamentally believe that you need a strong baseload power, and that can be done with gas. But we are convinced that we actually need to get away from gas. I mean, gas is obviously better than coal, but still has so many problems. And when you look at nuclear, I mean, de facto, so many more people have died because of coal than of nuclear. Yeah, and of course the risks are there, but they are relatively limited, especially with the latest generations of power plants. And countries like Sweden, they are very convinced that they need this space. They have big problems in the grid with the wind going up and down, and they have now a strategy to build several of these reactors and to reduce the technical risk, but also I think which the risks with nuclear that are much stronger are the financial risks, because the two last nuclear plants that have gone live in Europe, in Finland and in the UK, they have just cost 10 times more and are not a good business case.
Is that Hinkley, the one in the UK, I think, but it's not doing too well.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's even launched yet. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think in the UK it's not even launched. It's delayed and it's way more costly. And
You'll be lucky to see an infrastructure project get finished in the UK on time.
Yes, but for nuclear it's extremely hard. Yeah, and the answer of Sweden and also of us and why we invested in the company that we invested in is small modular reactors. So way smaller reactors that are way more standardized and that you hopefully can industrialize and repeat and copy them, which then hopefully also makes the cost controllable and the project management and the duration and all that. And we believe that this is what needs to happen. That you can do it like an offshore wind project, which is still a complex project, yeah, and it maybe gets delayed by a year, but probably not by 10 years, yeah. And we invested actually in a small modular reactor project developer. So not in the technology, not in a new reactor design or something like that, but simply this project development and professionalizing the industry. And role models are indeed the offshore wind industry, where you have Sweden and Denmark, big, very professional project developers. And this is what we believe also needs to happen in nuclear. And so the risk that we take is not so much a tech risk, but it's much more a regulatory risk that Sweden and Finland particularly will stay on this track and continue to push it. Yeah.
I'd like to stay on the topic of nuclear just for a little bit longer. This is kind of might be a little bit of a strange question, but I went to a talk at my university and there was a nuclear policymaker, and he's saying a lot of the sort of pushback against nuclear is because at its core, it can be also inherently linked to proliferation, right? Because you're dealing with fissile materials that, like you alluded to earlier, they're dual use, like a lot of things are. And when you have them in the hands of governments, and that there's always a risk there that they're going to be utilized for other things, as to avoid waste and that sort of stuff. So I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Absolutely, but I think there again we talk about developments in Europe, in some of the countries which was the strongest democracies on the planet. Yeah, I think these risks are very true, but I think much more on the outskirts of Europe, or Korea and Iran and all these things. Yeah. And I think you can rather argue it's important that we in our markets have the knowledge and the know-how and missions to manage that and to handle that and to understand it. It's way more risky if we all go out of that and only leave it to the risky states. Yeah.
And then another topic on the question of nuclear, something like small modular reactors, right? It seems like a hugely important development to make nuclear more accessible to different industries. But I guess to run due diligence on something like that, you have to have probably a quite technical team, I imagine, and it's a long and lengthy process. So how do we encourage more capital into these sort of important things from people who might not be able to, go through that sort of intellectual manpower to get to that point? Or is that even the right question to be asking? Can we just rely on funds like you to do it?
No, I think you ask a very fair question, and that's also one reason why it's way harder for hardware startups to raise money versus software, because software, you don't need a big understanding. The scaling mechanisms are relatively similar and so on, and way more funds feel comfortable investing in that. And I think we fundamentally need more funds at all stages that do hardware, and what do you need for that? Of course, you need a basic technical understanding, and some of our founders are engineers, and we also have a network of investors in our funds, but also just people that we know or that we consult and pay that can assess the technology. But fundamentally, I'm not an engineer, and when I do a due diligence, I also want that the founders and the team are able to explain it to me, why this works. And then I think the core of our due diligence is always the business case. Yeah, to whom do you sell? Is the need of these customers really big enough? Is there really a pull? Does this have a positive business case? Do you need to rely on green premiums or not? Or and I think of course, we also need to do a technical due diligence, but that is way easier to outsource and to get insights on and get someone doing that than the business models question. This always, even after a very good due diligence, you need to make assumptions and convictions, and this is the real risk that you typically take. Yeah. So I think we need more, and of course, it will also be that the funds are more specialized. So some only do energy transition, some only do biotech, some only do this and that. But yeah, we need way more of that.
Mm-hmm. Do you need to choose those startups that related to like sustainability or SDGs, those things? Because I think mainly about your portfolio mainly about like those hard tech and software investment. So like, is there any criteria that you need to select them based on like the sustainability factors?
Yeah. So we only invest in companies that have a strong green potential. Yeah. So what we do is we do a life cycle assessment, which basically means that we assess the CO2 saving potential of a technology. Really, and life cycle means really from the start to recycling or end of life and the full fledged. And we work with agencies who do a calculation on that. And this is what we base our investment on. But already very early on in the first call with every founder, I try to ask some questions about that and try to understand how essential this really is and if this really solves the problem in that direction.
So we hear all the time that VC funds are supposed to stay super, super lean, and the management fee should be, used very effectively with optimum efficiency. How do you communicate the need to LPs for some of these more expensive operational aspects, like, due diligence help and some of the more sustainability related things? It'd be great to get some thoughts there.
Of course, we had to do a business case and a calculation. I think that we are so these external things that I talk about. Yeah, we talk about, I don't know, 10,000 euro per due diligence. Yeah, so that's way less than the legal fees, and also
that's a good point to consider.
Yeah, and also I have to say, I think the VC industry per se is not very efficient. Yeah. So, and I would argue that small VC teams are typically more efficient than large ones. Yeah, so every time I have a co-investor with me who has, I don't know, more than 2 people on the deal, and that is relatively common with large funds. Yeah, they have a partner who makes a decision, but who is more busy with steering the fund and fundraising than anything else. Then you have a senior investor or principal or so, and then you have some junior. That is actually inefficient, and that leads to extra questions and extra rounds with the founders and so on, versus a small team model where there's a partner or a senior principal or so who is in the lead and in every call and all that. Yeah, and I would argue that that this is what we do. Yeah, so we try to be lean and efficient in our core processes, and then be very targeted on what we actually need and what questions we actually need to ask. And you're very true. Yeah, so a seed stage startup, you can't force to a lengthy reporting every month or so. So for example, our impact reporting is annual, and it's probably 20-line survey. Yeah, so it's still doable, and something that we expect is also, on the other hand, helpful to companies, because it actually brings them their CO2 savings, which is then also something that they can use for their customers and so on.
Yeah, well, I want to know more, like how many calls you take per week, or how frequent it is. Yeah.
With companies?
Yeah.
So I think we get every year around 1,000 applications of founders, and we are very strict in the early process. So I do not speak to more than 5, maybe sometimes 10 startups per week. And for my colleagues, it's similar. Because yes, we are lean, and we have our investment thesis, so we know essentially what we're looking for. And of course, we remain open to exciting deals and exciting founders on somewhere next to the themes. But we don't want to get too much into further topics. Yeah, so we're very strict there, not to do too much, both for us, for our internal efficiency, but also for the founders. Yeah, so I know that founders currently spend a lot of time fundraising and speaking to funds who de facto are not investing much, and we really don't want to do that. Yeah, so I only speak to a founder if I see a chance that this could end up in our portfolio.
Do you think it's a matter of how asset light soft tech the company is? Because sometimes I see partners posting like their screenshot their Google Calendar, and they're like blocked up with calls from Monday to Sunday, and it's like, first of all, how do you even remember all of those companies, and second of all, how do you, I guess, even think about applying value there, right? Because if you're making really thoughtful deals, like I imagine you are, which require a lot of mental effort from start to finish, I guess, is that why you take less?
I mean, when you think about that, yeah, so as an investor, fundamentally, we have a 3 to 4 year investment period where we, in our case, we make 15 to 20 investments. Yeah, so, and we have 4 partners. So I need to find every year 1 or 2 great companies. Yeah, and then think from that, what is most essential to do that? And I think it starts with having clear thesis and having a good understanding and knowing what I want, and having also the freedom to think a lot about that and to digest all the information that I get from the ecosystem, from the news, and to transfer that into investment decisions. Yeah, and that means I need headroom and I need time to think about. And then, of course, as an investor, you need a network. So I need to speak with other funds, and also speaking to founders is partly a market research. So you also see, what other companies do, what is achievable in certain times. So yes, of course, I need to talk to companies, but I think that already gives you an idea that I think it's not the most efficient to speak to so many people. And then the other thing is the internal processes. Yeah, so I have heard of funds who have, I don't know, 2 half days blocked every week for internal discussions and deal discussions and all that. that is probably also not the most efficient time spent. Yeah. And I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I worked for McKinsey, so I'm used to work a lot and very hard. I'm a mother of 2 kids, so my day has an ending. Yeah, at some point, I leave the room, and I cannot every night work very long hours. And I think that also forces me to make some decisions what I do and what I not do. And I think this makes me a better investor. But the jury is out. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking about women involving in the VC and investing, can you share about your journey of as a woman in the investment field, particularly in your climate and impact investing, what are the challenges you're facing now? And then, can you talk more about that?
Yeah. I think the biggest challenge is to bring more women into partner and general partner roles, and I think it's still apparently it's still very hard, and the funds are not very open. And I also have to say, in 2020, I was initially thinking of joining a fund, and I spoke to some, and I really couldn't believe it. I heard sentences like, "We don't believe that you, as a young mother, can make this job and do the transition from an operator to an investor." And I said, what? But this was really honestly meant, because it's a lot of work. And
feel free to name drop them on the podcast if you wanted. I'm joking.
So I think especially in Germany and Berlin, that is clearly different than Scandinavia. Yeah. And to me, this was one reason why I founded my own fund, and probably also why I did it with Scandinavian co-GPs. For them, this whole family thing is so much more natural, and my male colleagues take responsibilities there. It's not a woman thing. And also the whole ecosystem has much less of these evening events and endless calls in the evening. That's just not happening there as a general theme. So I think there's still a lot where especially Germany can learn. I think fundamentally, we women, actually, we have a lot of the skills that it takes in investing. Yeah, and investing is always this combination of soft skills, networking, also really HR, understanding founder personalities. So all these things that you always think women are better in. And then it's, of course, KPIs and numbers, but very basic, on a very high level. You really don't need to be a physician or so to understand a business case and to make scenario analysis and all that. And and it's also a lot about multitasking and doing tons of different things. So I think naturally we women should be actually pretty successful in this. Yeah. So I think the main barrier is still the boys networks, and it's actually not really boys, it's older men who still click together and have these old networks. It's also still fundamentally that they invest more in male founders because they see the mini me. Oh, he's just like I was 20 years ago. I see the same wording. And so I think that's a lot of the problem. And what can we do to help it? Yes, of course, we need more funds with partners at the top. I still find it weird that government funds fund so many pure male funds. But slowly we're moving there. And now that I am a GP and running this fund, I don't see so many disadvantages. I think probably more advantages. I'm always invited on panels. I'm always recognized. People remember me. So yeah, I think that currently actually helps, but it's probably very hard to get there, and hard for women who are somewhere an investment manager in a male-dominated fund to find their way up. Yeah.
Any advice you can give those aspiring young women who want to enter the field of investment, especially climate investing, and then how can they make a difference with the communities, and how they can make impact? And what do you want to see women in playing this in shaping the future?
Yeah, So to very young women, I would give the advice to not shy away from technical studies. I think that's, I mean, mostly at that age, you don't know that you want to become a VC investor, but maybe you know, I have a technical passion, but I also want to do something in finance or business. And then I would rather say, don't study business, but rather do something technical, because the business thing you can learn later on. So I think that would be very early on. I think that's definitely helpful. Then I think what we are doing already is building alliances between the women. So there are many events and networking groups, and I also see that actually in our investments. Yeah, so we are investing in more women than other funds, but we also have more female co-investors. So the investment manager also is more often a woman. And I think that is something that we should continue to grow, to establish these women networks. And then I think it's also questioning the status quo, yeah, and so I know that in many traditional funds there are certain things that are not family friendly, yeah, that are just this is how we always did it, and of course that worked in the old days, but it doesn't work if you have dual careers and all that. So and fortunately also many men are now building allies there and say, hey, we don't need the investment meeting to start at 4. We can actually let it start after lunch, and then we're sure it ends when the family time starts, and things like that.
That makes so much sense to me. Just challenging these sort of cultural things that have become entrenched, but there's no real reason they need to stay that way, right? So
yeah.
I guess that lets me bring it back to culture and what it's like building a good culture at a VC firm, right? You mentioned that often doing these sort of large scale investment committees and partner meetings isn't always the most efficient way. But then how do you come to this sort of partner consensus whilst trying to build a good culture? And how do you make people collaborate without wasting too much time? I guess is my question.
Yeah. I mean, we are still a small fund, so obviously that is way easier if you are 5 to 8 people than it is when you are 20 people. But I fundamentally think you need to decide who does what, and you don't always need all the people in the room, and you also need to stay as a partner group, stay close to the companies and the deals and so on. Yeah, and this should always remain the focus of the stuff. And so, for example, we're only gradually growing the team, but we fundamentally said, let's rather hire people who help us with all the side stuff. Yeah, so communication, admin, reporting. Yeah, so let's rather get that out of our partners' time, but stay focused on deals and on portfolio companies and speak with the founders and all that. Yeah. And I fundamentally believe that for a normal fund, 100 million, 150 million early stage fund, you don't need tens of investment managers. Yeah. So you can also do that with a smaller team, and then of course focus more on the core, and you will maybe not see every deal, or you cannot understand every European market in full detail, but that does not necessarily mean that you make worse investments. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking then, what are some of the roles outside of investment management look like? And so I guess that's kind of things like platform, right? And making sure there's good talent availability, scouting, that sort of stuff. What does that look like at Climentum, first of all? And then second of all, how do you think VC firms in general can, obviously without giving away too many of your secrets, make sure they have access to some of these people who are looking to commercialize research or just like technical stuff for the benefit of society, but also turn into good businesses, right? Because I feel like, at least in my experience, I'm at a strong research university, and there's lots of guys who are, and girls sitting around in laboratories doing good research, but I don't know if they'd know the best path to commercialize that, whether that's through the university and, you know, risking equity side of things, but then also just like, I feel like we need to reach those people, right, and let them know that there are real opportunities out there to grow and scale huge businesses that can really benefit the world, right? So how do VC firms get to those people? Is my question.
Yeah. So maybe first on the organization. So we are a small team, with this fund. So we don't have a lot of support. But as I said, we as partners, we try to do the investments and work with the portfolio, and then we have support rather on comms and admin, and also try to outsource that. And I think this will also stay our focus. And we will, when you say platform, so we see our value add is in the personal relationship of the partners working with the founders, supporting with strategy, fundraising, on very personal interactions. And then the other thing is on the impact side, life cycle assessments, how to get grants, how to show your CO2 savings, and so on. And this is where we will build up our value add. And we believe there are other parties from whom you can get hiring support, marketing support, and tons of other things. We don't need to build that up, and our LPs don't need to pay for that at the end. And then you say getting out of university. So again, we are not a super early stage fund. So we only invest in companies that are real companies and that have a first product. And I think so our role is more to show these guys the vision, how this can look like, why this is aspirational to do this very hard journey, because founding a company is super tough and you can have way easier choices in life. But why this can be very fulfilling and good. So this is what I try to do. And then I think there are other incubators, very early stage teams who focus really a lot on this, how to get this done, what to do with the IP, how to find the right teams, bring them together. And I think fortunately a lot more is happening there now, also on the hard tech, deep tech side. So I see more and more promising companies. I was here in Germany, for example, at the Sprint event. So that's a Center for Sprung Innovation. So these are some of these initiatives that just help there.
We have a question from the last guest, who is she's called Claudia. She's I think kind of family office investment manager out in Singapore. The question was to the next guest: would you, as an investor, invest all of the money in your fund into your current portfolio company if you could? Or is that, I don't know if I've worded that correctly. Not if you could, but just would you? Is the conviction there?
It's actually very strong. I would say yes. Yeah.
That's great. And I know some VCs aren't too open about talking about their portfolio companies as maybe a favoritism thing, or they just don't want to speak to openly. But is there anyone in particular you'd like to shout out, or given the time you have, just talk about the great work they're doing?
All of them. The question is always which one to pick. So I talked about Jolt, and what they can do is really revolutionizing, because they take an old coating technology that basically where you have to base something and then heat it for hours at 800 degrees, and they basically just need to spray some ink on it and then heat it up for a few seconds at 180 degrees. So that could really revolutionize so many industrial processes. So super excited about them. And they are now raising a Series B round. So all interested investors, speak to Jolt from other companies. Fermify. So they are a biotech platform. And the first product that they are doing is vegan casein, so which is the core element of cheese. So with that, you can take any create cheese that has really this meltability and all that. But what they really can do is a very specific biotechnology at scale and at low cost, because biotech is currently often pharma, and that means very expensive. But if we want to revolutionize the food industry, we need to get super cheap to really compete with cows and all that. And that is just what fascinates me, because they can really meet these price points and bring that cost down. So these are just some, and this is a lot about the business model and what they can change. And that is what fascinates me.
I always get excited hearing people talk about alternative proteins, alternative foods. I've been vegan since 2019, but I can tell you that there's been so much talk and so little delivery. I just want to try them. Like, it's been too long, right? but yeah, I guess I had one more question quickly before we wrap up. All the way back in the podcast at the very start, you said something about making sure there's always a buyer on the other side, right? Making sure that demand is always there. And I guess that brings like the wider questions of FOMO in VC into question, right? Because I feel like, last week, A16Z closing like a 7 point something billion round on AI, right? I understand that AI is like a generational technology. It's going to revolutionize the way humans exist. But that enterprise and like infrastructural demand for AI isn't there yet, right? At least in my opinion, like the buyers aren't there. So do you think that's kind of a consideration in climate? Is that, are the buyers here yet? Do we have to think about future buyers? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. So we tend to say we don't invest in the hype. Yeah. So we really try to avoid these things. Yeah. So we have not invested into any ESG calculation platform. We have not invested in cultivated meat, which is also not yet ready, unfortunately. We have not invested in any direct air capture, which is also something that we fundamentally believe we will need to do as a society, but the costs are still way too high and these carbon markets are super risky. So we as a fund try to avoid that, but that's only one strategy. Yeah, and I think these true outline returns and that you then sometimes talk about, the 100x and so on, you can of course only get if you go into a hype, but you talk about the many failures on the road, yeah, and many complete write-offs, yeah. But for us, it makes way more sense to look next to the hype and to see who are the enablers, the picks and shuffles play to support a certain trend, and not the 1 out of 100 moonshot. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's almost time, but we still have a question. Like, do you have any question to ask our next guest?
No worries if not, but it's fine.
If it's a man, ask him what he is doing to promote more women in his fund or company.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely say that one.
Awesome.
And on that note, thank you so much. Yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Doerte, for giving your time. I would also like to reiterate, our guests don't have to do this. So yeah, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure talking to you.